So I'm going to talk today about compliance for global marketplaces and going to go over some stories from my time launching new products at Amazon globally, and then kind of how that can translate for how it works when you try to go to, say, Australia or to the UK, or just if you're trying to get on Amazon in general. Plenty of hopefully helpful information. And I will be going fairly quickly, so I'm going to try to get through most of the presentation. If I run out of time, then please stay for questions later, or you can take any of the handouts at our booth out there and email at info@thinkcascadia. Okay, so Cascadia is a group of former Amazonians. We focus on full service account management and compliance for brands. And our goal is to help people be successful on Amazon. We really do just Amazon, that's our focus. So when I think about selling globally, what challenges we faced were really about when you're trying to take something that is built for one marketplace or it's built for one consumer group and then trying to see if it will work somewhere else, sometimes that can lead to problems. So I know Amazon. Obviously, you guys probably saw me earlier and talking about Amazon, been there for a while. But what else do I know? I have also worked in the promotional products industry. It was quite fun working on some of the stuff for my local team, the Mariners, so, the Seattle fans. That one on the left is actually the mascot for the Mariners. It's kind of a funky little moose thing. It's actually a piggy bank, which is pretty fun. And the challenge there was the event that these are given away at, because it's like those giveaways at ballparks and stuff. The event was happening in a week and a half, and at the factory, the resin wasn't curing. So we had to come up with a way to get this resin product cured as quickly as possible so it could be airshipped in time for the game. So that was pretty fun. We ended up baking the plastic resin, but it all arrived on time, so that was the point. We also did some stuff for licensed products and for other promotional products. That actually is not a beer cooler. You might think it is looking at it, but it is not. It is a USB charger. So we had to make a little Corona beer charger thingy, and it's supposed to be like behind the bar. Like if you're really hanging out, like having fun hanging out, but your phone's about to die, then you can give it to the bartender and have it in the beer cooler charging while you're still hanging out. You don't have to worry about not having your phone. So here is the German Strathwood shop. Strathwood is one of Amazon's brands. This is one of the launches that I worked on. And you'll notice just looking at this, these are pretty darn heavy American-style furniture items. So the type of thing that you have if you've got a large backyard or you've got a large porch and you can put things in. How many of you have ever lived in Europe? How much space do people typically have in their yards? Yeah, about this much, not much space. And they just were like, oh, I think it'll do super well. Yeah, it didn't. Shocker. The only place that it did well was actually Bavaria, because there's actually people who have lots of money in yards in Bavaria, but everywhere else it was terrible. So, you know, you look at the difference there, you look at the typical things. So we went all throughout Europe, and the only place that did well was Bavaria. That was it. The feedback was, it's too American, it's too bulky, it's too big, it's too ugly. And so basically, you know, we had talked about this, and the product managers had never lived or been in Europe for whatever reason. They were in charge of the launch, and I was like, you need Bistro Sets. You need something that can fit on like a tiny little balcony, that'll work. And they were like, no, the Bistro Sets do terribly. I'm like, the Bistro Sets do terribly here. So knowing what works in your marketplace, instead of just being like, well, this works great here, it's super awesome, let's just take it right to Europe and be good. So we also did pins on. If you look on Amazon right now, you can find some really nice pins on stuff. I actually bought a bunch of pins on stuff for my own house. They're very heavy, luxurious towels, good stuff. This is a typical washer dryer from the US, right? You typically will have a washer dryer set. Sometimes they're stacked, but you typically have both. For those of you who have lived in Europe, you know where I'm going with this. That is a typical washing machine. And typically the dryer is built into the washing machine, and it's not a heat dryer. It like kind of sucks the air out of it. I don't know exactly how the technology works, but it's not a tumble dryer. So the problem with these giant, beautiful towels, and they were so thick and so luxurious, I love my towels, they filled up the entire washing machine, and they wouldn't dry. They came out still soaking wet. And so the product wouldn't do well. It didn't sell well at all. They had to close that particular product line as well for Europe because it just didn't work. So they had to do a much lighter weight cotton terry for that. So the worst case scenario is if you have a regulatory issue. Most of the time, people get used to how easy it is to import into the US. I think there are about 110 port officers for the CPSC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission. That's it for all the ports. That's air and sea. There's not very many of them. There's 2 for the entire port of Seattle, which is a pretty darn big port from an air and an ocean perspective. They cover Seattle, Tacoma, and the airport. And there's just like 2 of these guys. I feel so bad for them. The difference in Europe is that most of those are actually fairly well staffed. So you end up having situations where people will try to bring something in, and the European Rapid Alert System, it's a terrible acronym. I think it was a non-native English speaker who came up with it. But basically, things will get taken down just for not meeting the chemical standards, which is pretty tough for a lot of people here to even think about, except if you've had any dealings with Prop 65 in California, that sucks. But mostly, it's just, even if you can't prove that you're compliant, they can take you down. So what Amazon learned is know your customer in that country and make adjustments. Don't just think that because Americans love it, you can just go somewhere else. In general, Amazon does this. They'll launch something on .com, they'll launch a new service, they'll launch a new product line. They'll start something on .com, and then they'll take it elsewhere. And for the most part, if you're talking about like seller central features, that works just fine. Because you test it out on the American sellers, see if they like it, great, let's move it to the UK. But product doesn't work quite so efficiently that way. So the compliance requirements for Amazon sellers, I believe that these slides will be available afterwards, so you don't have to worry about reading them in detail, but just had this up here for you, just so that you know what the compliance requirements are. If you're in Marketplace, it's much easier to comply on paper. So just keep that in mind. If you are a vendor and you sign that paper on the dotted line, it's a little bit harder to comply, honestly, if you're actually trying to comply with it. There's much more stringent insurance requirements. You actually are supposed to abide by the supplier code of conduct for your overseas factories or for whomever you're working with, which is actually harder to meet in the US than it is overseas in a lot of ways. And there's a whole bunch of requirements that Amazon has around compliance for vendors. Now, how much they actually enforce that is a different issue, but just so you know, that is what's being signed on the dotted line. So these are the products of concern that are listed in the vendor contract. These are the ones that Amazon requires additional insurance for. So these are the ones that I always like to call out for folks. If you are selling any of these on Marketplace, obviously on vendor side, you need to get the insurance. That should be pretty basic. You should have it already, really. But on the Marketplace side, these are the ones that are most likely to result in consumer investigations. If someone files a complaint or writes a customer review or contacts customer service, these categories are the most likely to actually be investigated by Amazon. So if this is any of yours, just make sure you've got all your paperwork in order. Okay, so just talking about knowing your factory. It's one of those things where if you've been in this industry a long time and developing product, and I think a lot of you are representing manufacturers, is that correct? How many of you are representing manufacturers here today? Okay, how many of you are selling on Amazon but not your own brand? Okay, so not that many of you. There is a little bit of liability that's attached to selling somebody else's stuff that's not yours, only if you repackage or bundle it, changing the warning labels and the packaging. For the most part, it's only importers and manufacturers who really need to pay special attention to their factory for quality, regulatory, and safety reasons. So in this particular situation, I'll go back so you can see the picture, we couldn't figure out why there were flecks of paint on the bobbleheads. I don't know if you've ever gotten a bobblehead from one of those giveaways at a game, and they're so fun. I love bobbleheads. Like, it just always makes me laugh. I don't know why, but these ones had a lot of quality issues because there would be like blue paint on the guy's face or something. That's obviously not going to work. And so one of the things that I was supposed to look at when I was visiting Shenzhen that time is what could be happening. And what was happening is the workers were just stacking the items that they just hand-painted, because these are hand-painted baubles, onto a big tray, and they were reusing the same trays over and over again without making sure that they were dry first. And so layers of paint just kept going on layers of paint, just kept going on layers of paint, and so different flecks would go on the baubles. And the simple solution was to have some sort of piece of paper or some sort of wiping process in between each one of the painting jobs so that there wouldn't be layers of paint flecking on it. And the only reason why this even came up, because the factory didn't understand that it was a problem. They couldn't figure out where the paint was coming from either. And it literally just took me walking through and looking at the stacks and like, oh, that paint is wet. That explains it. So things like that, it's hard to see that without going there. Sometimes you can, there was a company that we worked with, a inspection service company that had GoPros. And so we were able to ask them to take a GoPro in and then watch the footage. And then you can get some benefit from that. Sometimes you just have to suck it up and pay to go to China or wherever else is being produced. So you can see how they got stacked up. Those ones weren't painted, but that's how they were stacking the painted ones too. Okay, so the factory and target customer segment kind of goes into the concept of social responsibility. And I know that is something that a lot of smaller companies don't really spend a lot of time on. If you are selling to Amazon as a vendor, you're supposed to meet their supplier code of conduct. A lot of people don't either know that or follow through with it, but it's there. It's, know the rules if you're breaking them. So if it aligns with your target customer segment, if you think about the issue that happened a few years ago, there was a problem of someone complaining in the 2016 presidential election about certain products that were coming in that were clearly not made in the United States. These are Donald Trump bobbleheads made in a factory in China. And I don't think that plays very well with the base that would be interested in such a bobblehead. But yeah, she was probably in her 50s and painting these with paint without any sort of protective equipment and open turpentine containers, pretty terrible stuff. So other things that can cause problems when sourcing globally. There we go, okay. This was an open waste container. So the leftover turpentine with paint bits in it were just dumped in there. So you can have various problems, fires or damage inside your factory that cause delays. That's kind of lame. There was also one particular thing that we worked on for an Amazon product where we found out that all of the oil that was kind of splattered onto the textile was cleaned using gasoline. And the gasoline is all just like in open tubs. Actually, if you ever, this is apparently something that people in the 50s and 60s used to do, is use gasoline to clean oil stains off of shirts. So in case you ever wanted to do that and try it out at home, I wouldn't recommend it. So the auditors are the thing I mentioned. Sometimes you can get them to do the GoPro. Sometimes you can get them to just take tons and tons of pictures. And they're usually trained for this work. So I personally don't feel qualified to audit a factory. I mean, I could go around and look at it and take pictures and fill out the form because I used to review the forms, but I'm not a trained auditor. This is not something I do all the time, and it's not my native language. So I have people who are like, oh, but I go to China all the time. And it's like, okay, but do you know what you're doing? So one of the things that Amazon used to do is what are called ride-alongs. So the company that would do the audit was a qualified third-party accredited auditor company. I think at that time, we were primarily using SGS. I know SGS was around earlier. You guys are sure? There you are, yes. And then a ride-along is when someone goes with the auditors from Amazon and goes and can ask the auditors questions as they're going through, and then you can figure out what's going on by asking the experts. And for the most part, those day audits are only $800 to $1,000, so pretty affordable. So anti-corruption is always fun. I have a picture here of mooncake in a red envelope. And you may wonder, what is wrong with mooncake? I had the same question at first. Mooncake is kind of delicious in small doses. It's like 1,000 calories for one of those little things. What you do is you have food under the bottom here, right here. The food is right here, and then right below the food, there's like a little piece of paper, and then the money goes underneath there. And so the gift of mooncake is not just a gift of mooncake. So that took a little bit of effort to understand. And then the red envelopes, of course, that just has money. That's an obvious one. So the challenge that you have when you don't use an accredited provider is there's not anti-corruption policies in place. A lot of them will move inspectors and auditors around so they don't form really close relationships with the local factories. So it can be a good way of making sure that you don't have extortion or blackmail or any sort of bribes that happen between the reviewers of your product and the makers of your product. So people are like, well, if it's happening there, well, of course it happens there. What about here? So in Vietnam, that was actually a really big problem for us. We sourced in Vietnam for some of those furniture products. And they'll just tell people to stay overnight. They'll work you for like 24 hours straight. That was just a typical problem. So you have to be really careful about what you ask for because the management at the factory will make everyone stay until it's done. A big problem in Southern California and a lot of areas in the US is legality of labor. So that's a big problem here. You don't see the same kind of issues, you see different kinds of social compliance issues here. So often the problem is that what you don't know about what's going on is that it can hurt your brand really badly. So this is from one of the collapses a couple years ago in Bangladesh. And this was a garment factory. And in the garment factory, they found a lot of, I think this one was one of the ones that had Levi's in it. But they, you see the labels on there, and now there's a big black eye in the brand's face for sourcing in a place that's so dangerous. And this is the kind of thing that happens when they stint on steel rebar, right? You just pay the building inspector to say that it's safe, and then, now it's not safe, and everything collapses, and that's just awesome. So there's also voluntary standards that you can follow to save yourself time and effort that are really common in Europe. So I'm going to go over two of those, the Ecotech Standard and the Forestry Stewardship Council. What this is meant to solve is issues like this, knowing the most popular color for the season by looking at the river. This has gotten better since last year. Last year, the Chinese EPA really cracked down on this sort of thing, and a whole bunch of textile factories and mills were closed until they fixed their issues. Some of them haven't ever reopened. So that's kind of gotten a teensy tiny bit better, but if you get an Ecotech certified factory, Ecotech certified product, then you won't have this problem. So from a licensing perspective, if you work with any sort of licensors with your product, Disney is the most famous one that you don't want to tick off. They'll just shut you down. 30 days, all done. Okay, that's awesome. They just won't deal with it. You're not as important as their brand. So this is an interesting situation where in the US, consumers weren't that worried about it, but in Europe it was a huge problem, and we actually got multiple customer service questions. So I have been talking about the Strathwood products. You saw that they were kind of heavy wooden products, amongst other things, and they were sourced from Vietnam and Indonesia. And the listing on the site said Forestry Stewardship Council certified, but that wasn't on the box and it wasn't on a label on the product. And so European customers were buying it and then saying, I didn't see the sticker on the box. Is this really FSC certified? There are multiple questions about this because in Europe, FSC has done a really good job of kind of consumer awareness and people knowing what FSC stands for. Whereas here, people just, you don't want to destroy the rainforest, right? It's kind of a generic concept of, it's kind of like not kicking puppies, right? Don't destroy the rainforest. But there's actually some real brand awareness around that. So you should know about that if you're going to go to different areas as well. Yeah, that's what it's trying to prevent. Okay, so then the question of on-time delivery, we've talked a little bit about making sure that things are in stock on Amazon. You spend a lot of time and effort and money making sure that your listing is ranked, only to find out that your factory says, sorry, but one of my suppliers can't get that component to me for another 2 months. And you're like, well, crap. So making sure that you have alternative sources as well. So we usually recommend that once you've got a product going, make sure that you have a backup factory. The biggest problem is with something like a licensing program. We had this problem a lot when I was working in promotional products. Anything that we did regarding Disney, we always had to make sure there were at least 2 or 3 backup factories because you never knew which one was going to be audited, and then it would get shut down, almost guaranteed for promotional products because promotional products are all cheap junk, and they're made at factories that can't comply, ever. So you just have to basically play a game of hope this one doesn't get shut down before I can ship. And so constantly making sure that there's alternatives. And the problem with Disney in general, and some of the, like the Home Depot as well, their social compliance requirements are just impossible to meet. Literally, it would be impossible for the factory to stay in business if they met them. And so what the factories are actually good at is cooking the books. So what you're really testing is how good of book cooking, how good at bookkeeping are you? Okay, so I completely forgot my dark and stormy night story. It was a client who called me, and it was actually in the middle of the winter, and he had a children's product, and I asked him if it was CPSC certified, and he said, what? I was like, okay, let's back up. It's children's. That means you need to make sure that you've got certification. And so with his challenges, he needed to go global. He was trying to go to the UK with the product, and at that time it was before Australia, so he wanted to go there but couldn't figure out how to distribute it. Now he's in Australia. And he had also been told that CSR, corporate social responsibility, was mandated by the licensor that he was using. It was through PBS or something. So they had a list of requirements that he needed to meet. He had no audit. He had nothing. He just had a product that was doing well on Amazon. And his factory was like, hey, you've been buying from us and it was just fine, so why are you asking for more stuff? Because we don't want to give it to you. So it was a little bit of a challenge there. And what we helped him do was to test and certify it, and we worked with an accredited third-party laboratory for that. And then went back to the factory to try to audit, work through it. The factory still wasn't going to cooperate, and so we ended up actually resourcing to a different factory who could do the product to the level that was expected by the licensor. Okay. So just go, yeah. I think this is towards the end. So one of the things that we focus on is how not to get sued. A lot of folks will focus on what Amazon wants, and that's awesome. Make sure that Amazon doesn't get mad at you because you spent a lot of money to be successful there. But also in the US, the most common way of enforcing product safety is through lawsuits, and those can be kind of expensive.